Mustang horse stops in front of police car and begs for help. They turned pale when they saw the Arizona desert stretched amber and endless under a merciless sun, heat waves shimmering across the cracked asphalt as Colonel James Blackwood guided his weathered Chevy pickup along Route 66. At 62, his silver-streaked hair was cropped military short above a face mapped with lines from decades of service. Each wrinkle a story of battles fought in distant lands. His right leg ached where the prosthetic met his knee, a permanent souvenir from an IED outside Fallujah 15 years earlier. Beside him, Phantom trotted alongside the slow-moving truck, a majestic black Mustang whose scarred flank gleamed obsidian against the desert backdrop. His powerful muscles rippled beneath a coat marked by old bullet wounds, evidence of the wild horse's brutal past before James had found him. The Mustang kept pace effortlessly, occasionally tossing his proud head, as if to urge James to drive faster through the scorching afternoon. "Easy, soldier," James called through the open window, his voice a graveled rasp from years of shouting orders across battlefields and breathing in the dust of 3 war zones. "We're almost home." 6 years earlier, James had discovered Phantom during a veterans rehabilitation program in the high desert. The Mustang had been recently captured in a Bureau of Land Management roundup, a magnificent stallion deemed unadoptable after injuring 3 trainers who'd tried to break him. Scheduled to be destroyed, the horse had stood defiant in a holding pen, eyes blazing with the same haunted wildness James recognized in his own mirror each morning. A connection had formed instantly, 2 warriors damaged by violence, refusing to surrender. James had leveraged his military connections and reputation to gain custody of Phantom, promising to take responsibility for the dangerous animal. With patience instead of force, sitting for hours in silent communion outside the corral, he'd gradually earned the Mustang's trust. Now they were inseparable, an unlikely pair that had become legendary across Navajo County. The retired colonel who couldn't sleep in a bedroom after too many years in desert tents, and the untamable Mustang who chose to stay, although no fence could hold him. James had built a rudimentary cabin on the edge of his property, preferring its Spartan simplicity to the main house he'd inherited from his grandfather. Phantom roamed freely, disappearing sometimes for days to run with wild herds, but always returning to the cabin to James. "Another scorcher," James muttered, squinting through the dust-streaked windshield. The truck's air conditioning had died years ago, and the hot wind blasting through the windows offered little relief. His uniform shirt, old habits died hard, and he still dressed each day as if preparing for inspection, clung to his back with sweat. Phantom snorted in response, his coat dusty from their day's journey. They'd spent the morning at the Veterans Affairs office in Flagstaff, James volunteering, as he did every Tuesday, helping newer veterans navigate the labyrinthine paperwork required to access their benefits. Phantom had waited patiently in the shade of a cottonwood tree outside, drawing curious stares from passers-by, unaccustomed to seeing an unsecured Mustang standing sentinel as naturally as a parked motorcycle. Afterward, they'd stopped at the reservation, school where James taught history 3 days a week. The Navajo children adored Phantom, and the tribal elders respected the bond between man and horse, recognizing something ancient and sacred in their connection. Today, James had shared stories of the Navajo code talkers from World War II, history, the government textbooks, often minimized, but that lived on in the community's oral traditions. Phantom had demonstrated tricks for the delighted children, bowing and counting by stomping his hoof, intelligence that had once made him too challenging for typical trainers to handle. Now, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, both man and horse were ready for the quiet sanctuary of their remote homestead. The cabin appeared in the distance, a simple wooden structure weathered silver by sun and wind, nestled against red rock formations that glowed copper in the late afternoon light. 5 more miles and they would be... The truck's engine coughed, sputtered, then died with a whining groan. "What the hell?" James muttered, coasting to the shoulder before the steering locked up. Phantom stopped beside him, ears perked forward in alertness. James turned the key, hearing only the hollow click of a dead starter. With a sigh, he popped the hood and climbed out, his prosthetic legs stiff after the long drive. Steam hissed from the radiator, but James's experienced eye immediately spotted the real problem. The fuel line had been cut, a clean slice that couldn't possibly be accidental. Where? A cold feeling settled in his gut, instincts honed by decades in combat zones, sending warning signals through his nervous system. "We've got trouble, boy," he said quietly to Phantom, who had moved closer, nudging James's shoulder with his velvety muzzle. The Mustang's ears flicked backward, sensing his companion's tension. They were still 15 miles from home, in a dead zone with no cell reception, on a stretch of highway that might see no passing cars until morning. The desert temperature would plummet after sunset, and while James had survived worse conditions during deployments, his damaged leg complicated matters. He rummaged in the truck bed, retrieving an emergency pack with water, basic tools, and first aid supplies. As he shouldered the pack, the distant rumble of an engine caught his attention. A black SUV with tinted windows approached from the direction they'd come, slowing as it neared. James straightened, military training reasserting itself in his posture. Something about the vehicle raised his hackles. Too new, too clean for these rural roads, moving with deliberate purpose. Phantom tensed beside him, a tremor running through the powerful muscles of his shoulders. The horse could read James's emotions with uncanny precision, and now he pawed the ground nervously, tossing his magnificent head. The SUV stopped 30 yards away. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, tall, lean, dressed in desert camouflage that was too crisp, too new. Not a soldier, but someone playing dress-up. A second man emerged from the passenger side, similarly attired, but with a bulge under his jacket that James immediately recognized as a concealed weapon. "Colonel Blackwood," the driver called. Voice neutral, but carrying an undercurrent that raised James's internal alarms to red alert. "Having some trouble with your truck?" "Just a breakdown," James replied evenly, his hand dropping casually to rest on Phantom's neck, a silent signal they'd developed over years. The Mustang stilled, but his muscles remained coiled like springs. "Got it under control." The men approached, with measured steps. Up close, James could see the harder details, calloused hands that knew violence, eyes that assessed threats continuously, the slight bulges of body armor beneath their clothes. Not random travelers, not coincidence. "That's a mighty fine horse you got there, Colonel," the second man remarked, stopping just beyond arm's reach. "Unusual to see one running loose like that. No halter, no lead rope." "He doesn't need them," James said, feeling Phantom shift subtly, positioning himself between James and the strangers. "What brings you gentlemen out this way? Not many take this old stretch of highway anymore." The first man smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Looking for you, actually. You've been causing some problems for friends of ours." James's mind raced, scanning recent events for potential threats. His volunteer work advocating for veterans' rights had garnered some powerful enemies within private military contractors who preferred veteran complaints to remain buried. Then there was his testimony against a former commanding officer now working for an influential defense corporation, evidence of war crimes that had been conveniently classified. "Don't know what you're talking about," James replied, voice calm. Despite the adrenaline beginning to pulse through his system, his right hand made a subtle gesture against Phantom's flank, and the horse shifted weight imperceptibly. "Ready." "Sergeant Major Ellis sends his regards," the first man said, and everything clicked into place. Ellis, the court-martial 3 years ago. James's testimony had ended a decorated career and sent a man to military prison for atrocities committed against civilians in a village outside Kandahar. Ellis had friends, powerful ones with long memories and longer reach. Ellis made his own choices, James said, words clipped, "Just like you're making yours right now. This doesn't end well for anyone." The second man's hand moved toward his concealed weapon. "It ends today for you, Colonel. Nothing personal, just tying up loose ends." James tensed, calculating odds and angles, acutely aware of his disadvantages. Outnumbered, one good leg, exposed position. But he'd faced worse and survived. His fingers tapped a specific rhythm against Phantom's side, a command they'd practiced for emergencies. The Mustang exploded into action, rearing up with a piercing whinny that shattered the desert silence. Massive hooves pawed the air as the 1,000-pound animal transformed from calm companion to battlefield weapon in an instant. The men stumbled backward, the second fumbling for his gun. "Go!" James shouted, and Phantom dropped to all fours, charging. Straight at the men, with the precision of a cavalry mount. They scattered, the driver diving back toward the SUV while the armed man rolled aside, weapon now drawn. James launched himself forward despite his prosthetic decades of combat training. Overriding physical limitations, he collided with the armed assailant before he could aim, driving him into the dirt. They grappled furiously, James using leverage and experience to compensate for the younger man's strength. Phantom circled back, teeth bared as he charged the driver, who had recovered and was reaching through the SUV window. The Mustang's shoulder slammed into the man, crushing him against the vehicle door with a sickening crunch. James wrested the gun free, smashing his elbow into his opponent's throat. The man went limp beneath him, not dead, but no longer a threat. Breathing hard, James staggered to his feet, weapon now in hand. The driver slumped by the SUV, clutching his ribs, face contorted in pain. Phantom stood over him, ears pinned back, eyes blazing with protective fury. With the immediate danger neutralized, James's mind shifted to their precarious situation. 2 would-be assassins, a disabled truck, and night approaching in one of the most isolated stretches of Route 66. "Good boy," he murmured to Phantom, the horse immediately responding to his voice, backing away from the injured man but remaining vigilant. James searched both assailants, finding zip ties in a tactical pouch that he used to secure their wrists and ankles. The irony wasn't lost on him. Restrained with their own restraints, a quick inventory of the SUV revealed a satellite phone, which he pocketed, and more weapons. No police, not yet. These men were professionals, sent to make him disappear quietly. In the desert, a veteran with too many uncomfortable truths who'd finally pushed the wrong buttons. Ellis's connections reached further than James had anticipated. The immediate crisis handled, a deeper problem emerged. This wasn't over. Ellis wouldn't send just 2 men. There would be others, backup plans, a system designed to ensure no loose ends remained. The cabin wasn't safe anymore. Nowhere local would be. As the realization settled over him, James felt Phantom nudge his shoulder, the horse's breath warm against his neck. Those intelligent eyes seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. They needed to disappear, to find help beyond local authorities who might be compromised or outgunned. Night was falling rapidly, temperature dropping as darkness claimed the desert. James made a quick decision, grabbing essential supplies from his truck and the attacker's vehicle. He'd survived in hostile territory before. The desert was harsh but familiar. He and Phantom could navigate it better than any pursuers. "Come on, boy," he said softly, checking the confiscated weapons before slinging a pack across his shoulders. "We've got a long night ahead." With a last look at his disabled truck, the life he'd built literally breaking down behind him, James turned toward the open desert, Phantom matching his stride. They would travel cross-country, avoiding roads and settlements, using the wilderness skills they both possessed. There was a ranger station about 30 miles northeast, staffed by a former Marine. James had once pulled from a burning Humvee outside Baghdad. If they pushed through the night, they might reach it by dawn. As darkness enveloped them, man and horse moved as one shadow across the ancient landscape. Two warriors once again united against a common enemy, their silhouettes gradually disappearing into the vastness of the Arizona night. Dawn broke over the desert in watercolor strokes of crimson and gold, painting the sandstone formations in ethereal light. James and Phantom had traveled through the night, navigating by stars and James's unerring sense of direction, honed through 3 tours in featureless desert terrain. They'd avoided roads and settlements, moving across the open wilderness where the Mustang's instincts and James's military training created a seamless partnership. James's prosthetic leg had begun to chafe halfway through their journey, the socket grinding against his stump with each step across the uneven ground. By the time sunrise revealed their surroundings, his residual limb was bleeding and swollen inside the carbon fiber casing. Still, he pushed forward, jaw clenched against the pain, occasionally leaning on Phantom for support when the terrain became particularly challenging. "Almost there, boy," he murmured, patting the horse's sleek neck. Phantom's coat was dusty from their trek, but his eyes remained alert, ears constantly swiveling to catch any sound that might signal pursuit. The Mustang had seemed to understand the gravity of their situation from the moment the attack began, his normally independent nature sublimated entirely to the shared need for survival. The ranger station appeared on the horizon, a modest outpost, nestled against red rock formations. James approached cautiously, using field glasses confiscated from their attackers to survey the area for any signs of threat. The station looked quiet. A single vehicle parked outside, lights on inside, despite the early hour. Ranger Mike Redcloud was an early riser, a habit from his Marine days that civilian life hadn't changed. "Wait here," James instructed Phantom, moving toward the edge of a juniper grove that would conceal the horse's distinctive silhouette. The Mustang huffed but complied, dropping his head to tear at some sparse desert grass while keeping his attention focused on James. James approached the station using natural cover, moving in the methodical pattern of a man who had conducted reconnaissance behind enemy lines. His prosthetic limb complicated his movements, but decades of adapting to the disability had made him adept at compensating, distributing his weight to minimize noise. When he reached the rear of the building, he paused, listening intently before tapping a specific pattern on the back door, a Marine Corps cadence that would be immediately recognizable to Redcloud. The door opened a crack, then wider, as recognition dawned on the ranger's face. "Colonel?" Mike Red Cloud's weathered features registered shock as he took in James's disheveled appearance. "Jesus, what happened to you?" "Need to come in," James replied tersely. "Got Phantom with me. We've got trouble." Mike's eyes narrowed, but he stepped back, allowing James entry. A decade earlier, then Captain Blackwood had dragged Lance Corporal Red Cloud from a burning vehicle outside Baghdad, carrying him 2 miles to a medical station despite shrapnel wounds to his own back. Some debts transcended paperwork and protocol. "Phantom's out in the junipers," James added, limping to a chair and sinking into it gratefully. "He'll stay put until I call him." Mike nodded, securing the door. "You're bleeding, Colonel, and you look like you've been dragged behind a truck." "Not far off," James grimaced, finally allowing himself to acknowledge the exhaustion and pain that adrenaline had kept at bay during their nighttime flight. "Got bushwhacked out on Route 66 yesterday. 2 professionals. They disabled my truck, waited for me. Would have been a body in the desert if not for Phantom." Mike's expression hardened. He moved to a cabinet, retrieving a first aid kit and a bottle of whiskey. "Military connections." "Ellis," James confirmed, the single name conveying volumes between the 2 veterans. "Looks like he's calling in favors. From prison." "Damn." Mike poured 2 fingers of whiskey, sliding the glass across the table. "Drink. Then let me look at that leg. You're leaving a blood trail a rookie could follow." James downed the whiskey in a single swallow, the burn a welcome distraction from the throbbing pain in his residual limb. He unlocked the prosthetic with practiced movements, sucking in a sharp breath as he peeled away the liner to reveal raw, bleeding skin where the socket had rubbed during their cross-country trek. Mike whistled low. "That's gonna need more than a bandage, Colonel." "Just clean it," James replied, teeth gritted. "Wrap it tight. I need to make some calls." "Phones are down," Mike said, dampening a cloth with antiseptic. "Storm took out the lines 2 days ago. Satellite uplinks working for emergency services. Only cell reception out here is a joke on a good day." James cursed under his breath, calculating options. The satellite phone he'd taken from his attackers had died shortly after they began their desert crossing. A backup security measure, most likely, designed to prevent exactly the kind of appropriation he'd attempted. "How about radio?" he asked, as Mike cleaned the wound with methodical precision. "Got the standard Forest Service channels, police band too." Mike wrapped the residual limb with practiced efficiency. "But if these guys are as connected as you think, putting a call out might just tell them exactly where to find you." James nodded grimly. His years in intelligence operations had taught him the extent to which seemingly secure communications could be compromised. If Ellis had enough pull to send professional hit teams across state lines, he certainly had the resources to monitor emergency channels. Mike finished bandaging the leg and stood. "Let's get your horse. Sun's getting higher, and anyone searching will have better visibility soon." James reattached his prosthetic, wincing as it seated against the freshly bandaged stump. He limped to the door, placing 2 fingers in his mouth to produce a sharp, distinctive whistle. Moments later, Phantom emerged from the juniper grove, trotting toward the station with fluid grace. "Magnificent animal," Mike commented, genuine admiration in his voice. "Hard to believe he was scheduled to be destroyed when you found him." "We understood each other," James said simply, reaching out to stroke Phantom's muzzle as the Mustang approached. "Both too stubborn to die when others thought we should." Mike led them to a small barn behind the station, designed to house the 2 patrol horses the rangers sometimes used for backcountry traversal. Get him settled. I'll see what supplies I can pull together. You can't stay here long, but you need rest and a plan. Inside the barn, James removed his pack and sank onto a bale of hay, fatigue washing over him in waves now that they'd reached temporary sanctuary. Phantom moved restlessly around the enclosure, still on high alert despite the relative safety of their surroundings. "Easy, soldier," James murmured, the familiar address seeming to calm the Mustang. Phantom approached, lowering his proud head to allow James to check him for injuries from their arduous journey. The horse had fared better than his human companion, desert-adapted and possessed of a stamina that domestic horses could never match. Years in the wild had made him resilient in ways that complemented James's military training. As James ran his hands over Phantom's legs, checking for heat or swelling, his mind worked through their limited options. Ellis's reach was substantial, a network built through decades in special operations before the war crimes that had ended his career. Local law enforcement wouldn't have the resources to protect them from the kind of professionals Ellis could deploy. Federal agencies might, but navigating bureaucracy would take time they didn't have. The door creaked open, and Mike entered with an armload of supplies: food, water, medical materials, and maps. "Perimeter sensors just picked up a vehicle approaching from the south," he said without preamble. "Could be nothing. Could be trouble." James was on his feet instantly, pain forgotten. "How far out?" "About 5 miles. Moving fast for these roads. Your vehicle's out front?" Mike nodded. "Forest Service truck. Keys are in it." James shook his head. "Too obvious. They'll be looking for vehicles." He moved to the barn door, peering out at the surrounding terrain. "We need another option." Phantom nudged James's shoulder, drawing his attention. The Mustang's intelligent. Eyes seemed to convey understanding beyond animal instinct. James had seen this look before, when they'd faced flash floods or wildfires together, Phantom somehow grasping the nature of threats and offering partnership in addressing them. "How?" "Well, do you know these back roads?" James asked Mike, a plan forming, "like the back of my hand. Been stationed here 5 years. I need a route that avoids main roads, but could get us to authorities we can trust, someone beyond Ellis's reach." Mike unfolded a topographical map, pointing to a winding line that snaked through the wilderness. "Old mining trail, mostly forgotten. Comes out near the tribal police headquarters in Blue Canyon. Chief there is Thomas Whitefeather, served with the Army Rangers in Afghanistan. Man of honor, and the reservation gives him jurisdictional advantages that might complicate things for your pursuers." James studied the route. 20 miles of rough terrain, but manageable with Phantom, especially now that they'd had some rest. "How long would it take them to reach us here?" 30 minutes, maybe less. Depends if they're familiar with the access. Road. We need a diversion, James decided. Something to make them think we've gone in another direction. Mike's expression shifted. A strategic calculation that reminded James of their shared military background. "I could take your blood-stained bandages, plant them along the eastern trail. Make it look like you're heading for the highway." "That might work," James nodded. "But it puts you at risk." Mike's mouth set in a grim line. "You carried me 2 miles with shrapnel in your back, Colonel. I can handle some risk." While Mike gathered the discarded bandages, James checked the confiscated weapons, ensuring they were loaded and secured. Despite the exhaustion pulling at his mind had shifted fully into tactical mode, assessing threats and resources with cold precision. "They're getting closer," Mike reported, returning from his task. vehicles matching the description of standard government contractor SUVs. Blacked out windows, reinforced chassis. James made his decision. We move now, northeast through the mining trails. You create the false trail, then report the station as all clear through official channels. Mike nodded, hesitating before extending his hand. Watch your six, Colonel. Always do. James clasped the offered hand firmly. 10 minutes later, James and Phantom were moving through the scrubland northeast of the ranger station, staying low and using natural features for concealment. Behind them, Mike Redcloud was creating a convincing trail of evidence suggesting they had fled eastward toward the interstate. It would buy them time. How much depended on the skill of their pursuers. As they crested a rocky ridge that would shield them from view of the station, James glanced back. In the distance, a plume of dust marked the approach of the vehicle Mike had detected. Professional killers coming to clean up what their colleagues had failed to finish. Phantom nudged James's shoulder, a gesture that had become their private signal of solidarity. The Mustang's eyes held steadfast determination, mirroring James's own resolve. They had survived hostile territories before, man and horse, warriors bonded by mutual trust and the shared will to endure. "Forward, soldier," James murmured, turning away from the approaching threat toward the wilderness that offered their best chance of survival. Phantom moved beside him, their shadows merging into one as they disappeared into the rugged landscape. Two veterans of different battles now fighting the same war. Midday sun blazed overhead, turning the Arizona wilderness into a furnace of heat and light. James and Phantom moved steadily through a narrow arroyo, the dried stream bed offering some protection from watching eyes while providing a natural path through the rugged terrain. Sweat soaked through James's uniform shirt, his water supply, already half depleted despite careful rationing. The repaired bandaging on his residual limb had begun to seep blood again, each step sending jagged shards of pain up his thigh. Phantom walked close beside him, occasionally allowing James to grip his mane for support when the ground grew especially treacherous. The Mustang's coal-black coat absorbed the brutal sunlight, but he showed no signs of distress, his desert heritage evident in his endurance. Every few minutes he would raise his head, nostrils flaring as he scented the air for potential threats, acting as a living early warning system that far surpassed human senses. "Good boy," James murmured, pausing in a patch of shade cast by an overhanging sandstone formation. He checked his makeshift compass bearing against landmarks on the horizon, confirming they remained on course toward the tribal lands Mike Redcloud had directed them to. "About 8 more miles. We'll rest here briefly." The Mustang lowered his head, snorting softly as if in agreement. James sank to the ground, removing his prosthetic to adjust the padding inside the socket. The temporary fixes he'd made at the J Ranger Station were deteriorating rapidly under the harsh conditions of their trek. He grimaced, examining the raw, weeping skin of his residual limb. "Not ideal," he muttered to himself, reapplying antiseptic from his dwindling medical supplies. If infection set in out here, their odds of reaching safety would plummet. He'd seen combat injuries go septic in similar conditions, had watched good soldiers succumb to seemingly minor wounds when medical care remained out of reach. A loud crack shattered the stillness, the distinctive report of a high-powered rifle echoing across the landscape. Phantom's head jerked up, ears swiveling toward the sound as a plume of dust erupted from the ground 50 yards behind them. Sniper. James reacted instantaneously, years of combat experience overriding exhaustion and pain. He reattached his prosthetic with lightning speed, scrambling up against the sandstone wall as a second shot ricocheted off rock inches from where he'd been sitting. "Go!" he commanded Phantom, expecting the horse to bolt to safety as any sensible animal would. Instead, the Mustang pressed against him, offering his body as a shield and leverage point. James grabbed the horse's mane, swinging himself onto Phantom's back in a fluid motion born of countless desperate situations they'd faced. Together, Phantom exploded into motion, surging forward with the acceleration of a thoroughbred despite his heavier Mustang build. The horse navigated the uneven terrain at a gallop, somehow finding stable footing where none seemed to exist. Another shot cracked behind them, this one not even close, the sniper adjusting to their unexpected speed and direction. James lay, low against Phantom's neck, making them a smaller target as the Mustang threaded through rock formations with uncanny precision. The fact that snipers had located them meant Mike's diversion hadn't worked or had been discovered too quickly. These weren't ordinary mercenaries. They were trackers with military-grade skills and equipment. "East," James directed, pressing with his knees to guide Phantom toward a series of broken mesas that might provide cover from the sniper's position. The Mustang responded instantly, veering into a steeper ravine that descended through stratified layers of ancient stone. The ground grew treacherous, loose shale sliding beneath Phantom's hooves, but the horse adjusted his gait with the intuitive balance of an animal born to this harsh environment. The rifle fell silent as they dropped below the shooter's line of sight. James knew this reprieve was temporary. Their pursuers would be mobile, coordinating to cut off escape routes. His mind raced, calculating options with the cold efficiency that had kept him alive through 3 wars and countless black operations. The route to the tribal police headquarters was compromised. They needed a new destination, preferably one their pursuers wouldn't anticipate. James mentally reviewed the map Mike had shown him, recalling a small highway patrol outpost marked along a secondary road about 10 miles northwest of their current position. State troopers might offer temporary sanctuary and communication channels beyond Ellis's immediate reach. The ravine widened into a broad wash, dotted with stunted juniper trees. James guided Phantom toward the northwest, the horse's powerful strides, eating up distance despite the punishing sun and rough terrain. They maintained this pace for nearly an hour, pushing the limits of endurance until Phantom's sides heaved with exertion and James's vision swam from dehydration and pain. Reluctantly, he signaled the horse to slow, guiding him into the shadow. Over towering butte. "Easy, soldier," he murmured, sliding from Phantom's back to check their surroundings. No signs of pursuit, but that meant little against professionals who knew how to move invisibly across this terrain. James offered Phantom water from his canteen, pouring it into his cupped hand for the horse to lap up. The Mustang drank sparingly, as if understanding their dire circumstances. James took a single swallow himself, rationing the remaining liquid with military discipline. "We need to keep moving," he told Phantom, stroking the horse's sweat-dampened neck. "But they'll be expecting that. Time to think like the enemy." James studied their surroundings with tactical precision. The butte cast a long afternoon shadow across the desert floor, creating a dark patch against the otherwise sun-bleached landscape. To the east, heat waves shimmered above the baking earth, distorting visibility. A strategy formed in his mind, unconventional, but possibly their best option. "Here's the plan, boy," he said, voice low as he leaned against Phantom's solid presence. "We're going to backtrack." It was a calculated risk, Standard pursuit protocol would have teams spreading out in a forward-searching pattern, assuming targets, would continue moving away from the point of contact. By doubling back, they might slip between search teams, provided they could move without being detected. James checked the position of the sun, estimating they had 4 hours until nightfall. Darkness would provide better concealment, but also meant colder temperatures and more difficult navigation. They needed to cover significant ground before then, finding a position that overlooked the highway where they might signal for help. With renewed purpose, James guided Phantom in a wide circle, avoiding their original tracks as they began moving south and slightly west. The Mustang seemed to understand the need for stealth, placing his hooves with deliberate care to minimize disturbance of the loose desert soil. They traveled this way for miles, James now walking beside Phantom to share the burden and preserve. The horse's strength. His prosthetic leg had begun to fail, the mechanical knee locking unpredictably with each step. But he pushed through the discomfort with grim determination. Desert-trained soldiers learned to compartmentalize pain, to function despite conditions that would incapacitate others. Late afternoon brought them to a vantage point overlooking a stretch of 2-lane blacktop, State Highway 77, if James's mental mapping was correct. From their elevated position behind a cluster of wind-sculpted boulders, they could observe vehicles passing below without being easily spotted. Traffic was sparse in this remote region, but every 20 minutes or so, a car or truck would appear, shimmering in the heat haze before disappearing around a distant curve. James watched each vehicle carefully, searching for any that might offer safe passage, or any that might harbor threats. "We need someone trustworthy," he told Phantom, who stood quietly beside him, occasionally pawing the ground with impatience. "Patrol car would be ideal, but we can't be picky." As if summoned by his words, a white Arizona Highway Patrol cruiser appeared in the distance, moving at a measured pace along the empty road. James felt a surge of cautious hope, tempered by wariness. Ellis's influence was substantial, but it seemed unlikely he could have compromised state law enforcement so quickly and thoroughly. "This might be our chance," James murmured, tension coiling through his exhausted body. He studied the approaching vehicle, noting it was a single officer. Patrol, standard for these isolated routes. The cruiser was about 2 minutes from passing directly below their position. James turned to Phantom, placing both hands on either side of the Mustang's proud head, bringing their eyes level. In 6 years together, they had developed a connection that transcended ordinary human-animal bonds, forged through shared dangers and unwavering mutual trust. "I need you to do something dangerous," he said quietly, holding Phantom's gaze. "But I can't come with you. Not yet." He outlined his plan, in low, steady tones, the same voice he had used to brief soldiers before high-risk operations. Phantom's ears flickered forward, his intelligent eyes never leaving James's face, seeming to absorb every word with uncanny comprehension. "You'll be exposed," James continued, throat tightening with emotion he rarely permitted himself to display. "I'll cover you as best I can, but you'll be vulnerable until you reach the road." Phantom huffed softly, nudging James's chest with his muzzle, a gesture they both understood. The horse had charged into gunfire to protect him before. Fear had never governed the Mustang's actions. James rummaged in his pack, producing a folded piece of paper on which he'd scrawled a terse message using a pencil stub from the ranger station. "Colonel James Blackwood, U.S. Army, RET. Targeted by armed mercenaries. Need immediate assistance, will follow horse. He secured the note beneath Phantom's forelock, tucking it where it would be visible but wouldn't fall away during the horse's descent to the highway. Wait until I signal, James instructed, easing himself into position behind a large boulder where he could maintain visual contact with both the road and the surrounding terrain. He drew the handgun taken from his would-be assassins, checking the ammunition one final time. The patrol car grew closer, its outline sharpening as it approached the point directly below their position. James studied the surrounding landscape with methodical precision, searching for any sign of their pursuers. Disturbed vegetation, dust clouds, the telltale glint of optics catching sunlight. Nothing visible, but that didn't mean they weren't being watched. Ellis's men were professionals, trained in the same techniques James had mastered during his military career. They could be anywhere, waiting for exactly this kind of desperate gambit. The patrol car was 30 seconds from the optimal interception point. James made his decision, turning to Phantom with a nod. "Go," he whispered. "Fast, straight to the road. Don't stop for anything." The Mustang needed no further encouragement. He wheeled away from their hiding place, powerful haunches bunching as he launched into motion, thundering down the steep slope toward the highway below. Dust billowed behind him, marking his path clearly against the red earth. James remained in position, scanning frantically for any reaction to Phantom's movement. A glint of light caught his attention, a reflection from metal or glass on a ridge about 400 yards east of their position. Someone was watching, and they'd just spotted Phantom's dash toward the road. "Damn it!" James hissed, raising his weapon as a tiny figure emerged briefly on the distant ridge. Too far for accurate shooting with a handgun, but he fired anyway, hoping to distract or delay whoever was observing them. Below, the patrol car had slowed as the officer spotted the unusual sight of a riderless horse charging toward the highway. Phantom had covered half the distance to the road, moving with the fluid grace that had always left James in awe, even after years together. Another movement caught James's eye. Closer this time, maybe 200 yards to the west. A second observer or shooter moving to intercept. This one was within effective range. James steadied his aim, controlling his breathing despite the adrenaline surging through his system. He squeezed the trigger twice in rapid succession, rewarded by the figure ducking for cover. Phantom had reached the highway, skidding to a halt directly in front of the patrol car, which braked hard to avoid collision. The Mustang stood his ground. In the middle of the road, head high, the note visible beneath his forelock, just as James had planned. From his vantage point, James could see the patrol officer emerge cautiously from his vehicle, hand near his sidearm, as he approached the unexpected roadblock. Phantom tossed his head, drawing attention to the note. The officer hesitated, then stepped closer, reaching slowly toward the Mustang's head. James held his breath as the patrolman retrieved the folded paper, opened it, and read the desperate message. The officer's body language changed instantly, head snapping up to scan the surrounding terrain, hand moving to the radio at his shoulder. He'd understood the threat, was calling for backup. Phase 1 of the plan had succeeded. Now came the dangerous part. James would need to make his way down to the highway without being picked off by the watchers he'd identified. He fired twice more toward the eastern ridge, then scrambled backward from his position, staying low and using the natural contours of the land for concealment. A shot rang out, striking rock near his head, showering him with fragments. One of Ellis's men had spotted his movement and was adjusting aim for a second attempt. James rolled behind a larger boulder, heart pounding as he calculated his next move. The direct route to the highway was too exposed. He needed another path. A dry wash cut across the slope about 15 yards to his right, offering partial cover if he could reach it unseen. James removed his prosthetic leg entirely, knowing it would slow him down and potentially give away his position. With its distinctive movement pattern, gritting his teeth against the pain, he began crawling toward the wash, using his elbows and single knee to propel himself forward while dragging the detached prosthetic alongside. Another shot kicked up dust inches from his position. The shooters were zeroing in, using his dust trail to track his movement. James increased his pace, abandoning stealth for speed as he half rolled, half crawled into the relative shelter of the wash. Once in the shallow trench, he reattached his prosthetic. The familiar agony of weight on his damaged residual limb barely registering through the combat-focused clarity that had descended over his mind. He began moving downslope through the wash, using its twisting path as cover while working his way toward the highway where Phantom and the patrol officer waited. More shots rang out, but they struck blindly now, unable to track his exact position through the wash's concealment. James pushed forward relentlessly, driven by the knowledge that safety was tantalizingly close. If he could just reach the patrol car before Ellis's men repositioned for a clear shot. Officer Ray Delgado had been 15 minutes from the end of an uneventful 8-hour patrol when the black Mustang appeared in the middle of Highway 77. 17 years on the Arizona Highway Patrol had exposed him to every manner of roadside oddity, but a riderless horse blocking traffic with what appeared to be a note tucked into its forelock was definitely a first. His initial assumption that some tourist's trail ride had gone wrong evaporated the moment he read the hastily scrawled message. "Dispatch, this is Unit 14. He spoke urgently into his shoulder radio, eyes scanning the surrounding landscape. Possible 10 to 78 on Highway 77, mile marker 233. Armed hostiles in the area targeting a retired Army colonel. Requesting immediate backup and tactical support." The radio crackled with dispatch's response. "Unit 14, can you verify this threat? What's your current status?" "I have a horse carrying a distress message. No visual on the colonel yet." Delgado drew his service weapon, maintaining a vigilant posture as he continued scanning the ridgelines. "Message indicates he's being pursued by mercenaries. Given recent cartel activity in this sector, I'm considering this a credible threat." The Mustang pawed the ground impatiently, then turned its head toward a rocky slope to the west. Ears pricked, inward with alarming intensity. Delgado followed the animal's gaze just as gunfire erupted from the hillside, a series of sharp cracks that sent him diving behind his patrol car for cover. "Shots fired! Shots fired!" he shouted into his radio. "Dispatch, I am taking fire from the western ridge. Multiple shooters." To Delgado's astonishment, the Mustang didn't flee the gunfire. Instead, the horse moved deliberately to the opposite side of the patrol car, positioning itself as if providing additional cover. Its behavior was so uncannily purposeful that Delgado found himself momentarily distracted despite the dire circumstances. "What the hell kind of horse are you?" he muttered, peering cautiously around the vehicle's bumper. Movement caught his eye. A figure descending the slope in an awkward but determined manner, half sliding through a dry wash that offered minimal protection from the ongoing gunfire. The man's gait was uneven, one leg moving differently from the other. Even at this distance, Delgado could see he was injured, his clothes dust-covered and bloody. The horse whinnied loudly, a sound that seemed directed at the approaching figure. The man raised a hand briefly in acknowledgement, then resumed his laborious descent, firing occasionally toward unseen threats on the ridge. "Dispatch, I have visual on the colonel," Delgado reported. "He's attempting to reach my position under fire. I need that backup yesterday." All units responding. ETA 12 minutes. Tactical team has been scrambled from Navajo County Sheriff's Office. ETA 20 minutes. 12 minutes was an eternity in a firefight. Delgado made a split-second decision, gunning the patrol car's engine and maneuvering it perpendicular to the slope, creating a larger shield against the incoming fire. The Mustang danced aside, then remarkably began moving up the slope toward the struggling man. "That horse is either the smartest animal I've ever seen or completely insane," Delgado muttered, providing covering fire as the Mustang reached the "Colonel!" The man grabbed the horse's mane, using the animal's strength to support his faltering steps as they descended the final portion of the slope together. Bullets kicked up dust around them, but the Mustang never faltered, positioning its body between the gunfire and the colonel with deliberate precision. When they finally reached the patrol car, the man collapsed against the vehicle, breathing heavily, his face etched with exhaustion and pain. "Colonel Blackwood?" Delgado asked, maintaining his covering position while assessing the man's condition. The colonel nodded, his voice a raspy whisper. "Thanks for not shooting my horse. Your horse is something else, sir." Delgado popped the rear door of his cruiser. "Let's get you inside before those snipers adjust their position." Blackwood hesitated, looking at the Mustang. "Phantom comes too. Sir, I can't fit a horse in my..." "He doesn't ride in it, he follows." Blackwood's tone made it clear this wasn't negotiable. "We don't leave him exposed to those shooters. He's the reason I'm alive." Before Delgado could argue further, the back window of his patrol car shattered, sending glass shards spraying across the interior. The snipers had repositioned for a better angle. "Get in! Now!" Delgado shouted, laying down suppressive fire toward the ridge. Blackwood hauled himself into the back seat with visible effort, his prosthetic leg catching awkwardly on the doorframe. The Mustang stood its ground, facing the hillside as if daring the attackers to shoot. "Phantom, with me!" Blackwood called from inside the vehicle, his voice carrying the unmistakable command tone of a senior officer. To Delgado's amazement, the horse immediately trotted to the passenger side of the patrol car, positioning itself for movement. Delgado slid behind the wheel, threw the car into drive, and accelerated southbound, away from the ambush site. In his rearview mirror, he saw the Mustang galloping directly behind them, matching their pace with powerful strides. "Your horse is keeping up with a patrol car doing 60, Delgado noted with disbelief. "He can maintain that pace for miles," Blackwood replied, voice tight with pain as he examined his bleeding leg. "Wild Mustang endurance. The ones that survive in the high desert can cover incredible distances." "What's this about, Colonel? Who exactly is trying to kill you?" Blackwood's eyes met Delgado's in the rearview mirror, haunted but resolute. "Former Special Forces commander named Ellis, serving time for war crimes I testified about. He's got connections, private military contractors, ex-operators who owe him favors. They disabled my truck yesterday, tried to make me disappear. Would have succeeded if not for Phantom." Delgado nodded, processing this information as he navigated the winding highway. "We've got backup coming. but it'll be at least 10 minutes. Before they reach us, is your horse really going to follow us all the way to the station? He'll follow me anywhere, Blackwood said with quiet certainty. We've been through worse than this together. The radio crackled with an update from dispatch. Unit 14, be advised we have reports of a roadblock ahead at mile marker 217. Black SUV blocking both lanes. Civilian witness reports armed individuals in tactical gear. Delgado cursed under his breath. They're cutting us off. Must have had a team already positioned down here waiting for you to surface. He glanced at his dashboard GPS. Mile marker 217 is about 5 miles ahead. Blackwood leaned forward, grimacing as the movement aggravated his injuries. Any alternate routes between here and there? Old service road about a mile ahead. Rough terrain, but my cruiser can handle it. Comes. Out about 10 miles south, bypasses their position completely. They'll have thought of that, Blackwood warned. Probably have someone watching it. Ellis's people are thorough. Delgado considered their options, painfully aware of how outmatched a single highway patrolman was against what sounded like a professional mercenary team. The tactical squad was still at least 15 minutes out, and the colonel's condition was deteriorating. The back seat was already stained with blood from his reopened wounds. "Colonel, how mobile are you if we need to leave the vehicle?" Blackwood's expression was grim. "Prosthetics damaged. I can move, but not quickly, not far." The service road turnoff appeared ahead, a barely visible dirt track branching from the highway into scrubland. Delgado made a split-second decision, cutting the wheel sharply and taking the turn without slowing. The patrol car bounced violently as it left the pavement, suspension groaning in protest. In the rearview mirror, Phantom followed without hesitation, adjusting seamlessly to the change in terrain, powerful legs eating up the rough ground with fluid strides. The horse seemed tireless, focused entirely on staying with the vehicle carrying Blackwood. They traveled less than a quarter mile when Delgado spotted the ambush. A camouflaged figure rising from behind a boulder ahead, raising what appeared to be a compact anti-vehicle weapon. "RPG!" Blackwood shouted from the back seat. "Military!" Training instantly identifying the threat. Delgado slammed the brakes and wrenched the wheel, sending the patrol car into a controlled skid behind a low rise that offered minimal cover. "Out! Now!" He scrambled from the driver's seat, yanking open the rear door to help Blackwood, who was already struggling to exit despite his injuries. They'd barely cleared the vehicle when the rocket struck, not a direct hit, but close enough to send the patrol car rocking on its chassis, windows shattering from the concussive force. Phantom appeared beside them, seemingly materializing from the dust cloud, nostrils flared and eyes alert. Blackwood grabbed the horse's mane, using the animal to support his weight as they moved away from the damaged vehicle. "Behind that outcropping," Delgado directed, pointing to a formation of weather-worn boulders 30 yards away. "Best cover available." They moved as quickly as Blackwood's condition allowed, the colonel leaning heavily on Phantom, while Delgado provided covering fire toward the RPG position. The horse seemed to understand the urgency, patiently matching Blackwood's hobbling pace while remaining solidly supportive. Reaching the rocks, they positioned themselves with backs against stone, Delgado checking his ammunition with methodical precision. 6 rounds in the magazine, 1 spare clip. Not great odds against professional operators with heavy weapons. Blackwood nodded grimly, producing his own confiscated handgun. 4 rounds left, won't hold them long. He glanced at Phantom, who stood vigilantly beside them, ears swiveling, to track sounds around their position. But we've got one advantage they don't expect: the horse. Delgado couldn't keep the incredulity from his voice. "Phantom isn't just any horse," Blackwood explained, his voice taking on an almost reverent quality despite their dire situation. "He was wild for years before I found him, survived poachers, predators, droughts. He can navigate this terrain better than any human, knows every hiding place and escape route." As if understanding, Phantom nudged Blackwood's shoulder, then turned his head toward a narrow gap between boulders, a passage barely visible unless you were looking directly at it. "He wants us to follow," Blackwood said with absolute certainty. Delgado hesitated. 17 years of patrol training warring with the unprecedented situation. Standard procedure dictated they should stay with the vehicle, wait for backup, but standard procedure hadn't accounted for rocket-propelled grenades or a seemingly telepathic Mustang. "Tactical team is still at least 10 minutes out," he said. "Finally, if they have thermal imaging, these rocks won't hide us for long." A shout from the direction of the disabled patrol car decided the matter. Their attackers were advancing, coordinating for a final assault on their position. "Lead the way," Delgado told Blackwood, who immediately turned to Phantom. "Show us." "Oi," the colonel said softly. The Mustang moved toward the narrow gap, pausing to ensure they were following, before proceeding into what proved to be a hidden ravine, cutting deep between rock formations. The natural corridor twisted away from the road, invisible from above or from the direction of their pursuers. Blackwood moved with renewed determination, despite his obvious pain, one hand maintaining contact with Phantom's flank as the horse picked its way through the ravine with confident steps. Delgado brought up the rear, occasionally glancing back to check for pursuit. "Your horse knows where he's going," he observed, as they penetrated deeper into the maze-like terrain. "He does," Blackwood confirmed. "Mustangs create mental maps of their territories, every water source, every sheltered area, every escape route from predators. His brain processes this landscape differently than ours." The ravine widened slightly, then branched into 3 separate passages. Without hesitation, Phantom chose the leftmost path, leading them into increasingly sheltered terrain where overhanging rock provided protection from aerial observation. "How far to the highway from here?" Blackwood asked, his breathing labored from exertion and pain. Delgado checked his handheld GPS. "About 2 miles southwest, but it looks like this formation of ravines extends almost parallel to the road for some distance." "Perfect," Blackwood nodded. "We stay in the ravines, move south until we're past their roadblock, then cut back to the highway where your backup will be coming from." A distant shout echoed through the rock corridors. Their pursuers had discovered the ravine entrance. Delgado estimated they had perhaps a 5-minute head start, not much against trained trackers in this terrain. "They'll split up, try to cut us off," Blackwood predicted, military assessment overriding his deteriorating physical condition. "We need to move faster." Phantom nudged Blackwood insistently, then lowered himself slightly, bending his front legs in an unmistakable invitation. The colonel looked stunned for a moment. "He wants you to ride," Delgado realized, equally surprised by the horse's apparent problem-solving. "He's never offered before," Blackwood said, voice tinged with wonder despite their desperate circumstances. With Delgado's assistance, he hauled himself onto Phantom's back, settling awkwardly without saddle or reins. The Mustang straightened carefully, adjusting to the unfamiliar weight with remarkable patience. "I'll scout ahead," Delgado said, moving forward while Phantom carried Blackwood at a measured pace through the winding ravine. The narrow passages occasionally forced them to proceed single file, but the natural labyrinth provided excellent concealment from their pursuers. After 20 minutes of tense progress, the character of the ravine changed, widening into a small box canyon with a steep spring trickling from fractured rock. Phantom moved directly to the water, allowing Blackwood to remain mounted while the horse drank sparingly. Delgado used the moment to check their position again. "We've covered about a mile. Another mile and we should be beyond their roadblock." "Position?" Blackwood nodded tiredly, the adrenaline that had sustained him beginning to ebb. "They won't abandon the hunt easily. Ellis's reputation depends on silencing me permanently." "Why did you testify against him?" Delgado asked, refilling his water bottle from the spring. "Seems like a dangerous enemy to make." Blackwood's expression hardened. Some lines shouldn't be crossed, even in war, especially in war. Ellis ordered an artillery strike on a village his intel said housed insurgents. I had conflicting information. Civilian families, no combatants. He ignored it, shelled the village anyway. 43 civilians died, 18 of them children. The simplicity of his explanation carried the weight of absolute moral conviction. Delgado nodded, understanding. Some choices transcended self-preservation. "We should move," Blackwood said after a moment, patting Phantom's neck gratefully. "They'll be closing in." As if confirming his words, a faint sound reached them. The distinctive crunch of tactical boots on loose stone, still distant, but drawing closer. Their pursuers were tracking them through the ravine system with methodical precision. Phantom's ears swiveled toward the sound, his body tensing beneath Blackwood. Without prompting, the Mustang moved toward the far side of the box canyon, approaching what appeared to be a solid rock wall, partially obscured by desert scrub. "Dead end?" Delgado asked with growing concern. Blackwood trusted Phantom's instincts. "I don't think so." The horse pushed through the scrub, revealing a narrow crevice barely wide enough for him to pass through with a rider. Beyond lay another ravine, this one angling more directly southward. "He's found us a shortcut," Blackwood said with quiet admiration. They squeezed through the hidden passage, Delgado leading the way with his weapon ready, Phantom carrying Blackwood close behind. The new ravine descended more steeply, taking them deeper into the network of water-carved passages that honeycombed this stretch of desert. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them, suggesting their hidden route change had temporarily thrown off the trackers. But both men knew this advantage was temporary. Professional manhunters would methodically search every branching path until they reacquired their target. "Your backup should be on scene by now," Blackwood noted as they continued their careful progress. "Question is whether they can find us in this maze." Delgado checked his radio for the dozenth time, still finding no signal in the deep ravine. "Standard procedure would have them establish a perimeter around the last known position. My patrol car. They'll be searching outward from there. And Ellis's men will be watching for them, planning their extraction once they've completed their mission." Blackwood's tactical assessment was delivered with clinical detachment despite being the target. "We need to reach your people before these mercenaries either find us or decide to cut their losses." Phantom continued forward, seemingly tireless despite carrying Blackwood's weight over increasingly challenging terrain. The horse navigated narrow passages and steep drops with the sure-footed confidence of an animal born to this unforgiving landscape. The ravine system gradually widened into a broad arroyo, its steep sides offering less concealment as they approached what Delgado's GPS indicated was the junction with Highway 77. Afternoon shadows lengthened across the desert landscape, painting the red rocks in deepening hues of amber and crimson. In the distance, barely audible, came the faint wail of sirens, backup finally arriving in force. Phantom's ears pricked forward at the sound, his pace quickening despite the fatigue evident in his labored breathing. The Mustang had carried Blackwood for over an hour through punishing terrain, an extraordinary feat of endurance that showcased his desert heritage. "We're close," Delgado said, checking his position again. "Highway should be just beyond that. Rise. My people will have established a perimeter by now." Blackwood nodded wearily, his face ashen beneath the grime and stubble of their ordeal. The bleeding from his residual limb had slowed but not stopped, leaving a trail of dark spatters on Phantom's glossy coat. The Colonel's military training had kept him focused and alert despite the blood loss, but his reserves were clearly depleting rapidly. "Ellis's men will be watching the obvious exit points," he warned, voice hoarse from thirst. "They won't give up just because reinforcements have arrived." As if confirming his assessment, the crack of a high-powered rifle echoed across the arroyo. The shot wasn't directed at them. Its report came from the direction of the highway, suggesting the mercenaries were engaging law enforcement. "Firefight," Delgado said grimly. "Sounds like your friends have decided to shoot their way out rather than abandon the hunt." Phantom halted abruptly, head raised and nostrils flared as he scented the air. The horse's entire posture had changed, muscles tensed beneath Blackwood as if preparing for imminent threat. "Something's wrong," Blackwood muttered, interpreting the Mustang's behavior with the practiced ease of their long partnership. "He senses danger ahead." Delgado scanned the terrain warily. The arroyo they'd been following curved around a jutting shoulder of rock before presumably opening toward the highway. The formation created a natural bottleneck, a perfect ambush point for anyone anticipating their route. "Could be an overwatch position on that ridge," he suggested, indicating the higher ground to their right. Perfect sight lines into this channel. Blackwood considered their options, military assessment overriding the fog of pain and fatigue. "Backtracking loses our advantage. Forward takes us into a potential kill zone." He patted Phantom's neck, feeling the horse's muscles quiver with tension beneath his hand. "What do you think, boy? What are you sensing?" The Mustang shifted restlessly, then turned his head decidedly toward a nearly invisible game trail that branched from the main arroyo, climbing the steep embankment to their left. The path was barely wide enough for a human, let alone a horse. "And carrying a rider. He wants us to go that way?" Delgado asked skeptically. "Can he even make that climb carrying you?" "If he thinks he can, I trust him," Blackwood replied simply. "His instincts have kept us both alive before." Decision made, they altered course, Delgado leading as they approached the narrow trail. Up close, it appeared even more precarious. A thread-like path carved by generations of desert bighorns, winding up the near vertical face of the arroyo wall. Loose shale and crumbling sandstone made each step treacherous. "I should get down," Blackwood said, preparing to dismount. "Too dangerous for him to carry me up that." Phantom disagreed, sidling away when Blackwood attempted to slide off his back. The Mustang snorted forcefully, then approached the base of the trail with deliberate purpose. "I think he's insisting," Delgado observed with grudging admiration. "That's one stubborn horse." Saved my life more than once with that stubbornness, Blackwood replied, settling back and gripping Phantom's mane as the horse began the ascent. Best I can do is stay centered and let him work. Delgado went first, scrambling up the crumbling path while maintaining vigilance for threats above. Phantom followed with astonishing precision, each hoof placement deliberate and tested before taking his weight. Blackwood remained absolutely still, trusting the Mustang's judgment implicitly as they climbed. The ascent was agonizingly slow. Each yard gained a victory against gravity and treacherous footing. Halfway up, a section of the trail crumbled beneath Phantom's hind hoof, sending a cascade of stones clattering into the arroyo below. The horse recovered instantly, powerful haunches bunching as he leapt to more stable ground, somehow maintaining his balance despite Blackwood's weight. "Easy, boy," Blackwood murmured, heart pounding as they resumed their climb. "Steady now." Another burst of gunfire echoed from the direction of the highway, closer this time. The firefight was intensifying, moving in their direction as law enforcement presumably pushed back against the mercenaries. Time was running short. They needed to reach friendly forces before being caught in the crossfire. Finally, they crested the arroyo wall, emerging onto a flat mesa dotted with stunted junipers and barrel cactus. Delgado consulted his GPS, orientating himself quickly. "Highway's half a mile that way," he said, pointing southeast. "Terrain stays high all the way. We'll have good visibility." Phantom stood trembling slightly, flanks heaving from the exertion of the climb, yet still alert and watchful. Blackwood stroked the horse's sweat-dampened neck with profound gratitude. "Outstanding work, soldier," he said softly. No military animal in his long career had shown such extraordinary judgment and heart. They moved forward across the mesa, maintaining cover where possible while advancing toward the sounds of the ongoing confrontation. As they approached the highway, the situation below came into view. A tactical standoff between multiple law enforcement vehicles and two black SUVs positioned as a makeshift roadblock. Officers in tactical gear had established a perimeter, pinning down what appeared to be 4 or 5 armed men using the SUVs as cover. "That's Sheriff's Office tactical team," Delgado confirmed, recognizing the markings on the armored vehicles. "State police too. Your friends are surrounded." Blackwood studied the scene with the calculating eye of a combat veteran. "They're buying time, waiting for extraction. Ellis would have contingencies, probably a helicopter inbound. These aren't men who plan to be captured." As if summoned by his assessment, the distant thrum of rotor blades became audible, growing louder by the second. A black helicopter appeared over the eastern horizon, flying low and fast toward the standoff. "Told you," Blackwood said grimly. "Private military contractors have resources." Delgado keyed his radio, finally getting a signal now that they were clear of the ravines. "Dispatch, this is Officer Delgado. I have Colonel Blackwood. We're on the high ground southeast of the engagement zone. Be advised, hostile extraction helicopter approaching your position." The radio crackled with an immediate response. "Delgado, where exactly are you? We've got men searching the entire area. On the mesa overlooking the highway, we can see the whole situation. Hostiles are expecting extraction by air. 4, maybe 5 mercenaries pinned down by your perimeter. Stay put. We're sending a team to your location." The urgency in the dispatcher's voice was unmistakable. "Colonel Blackwood's safety is priority 1. Below, the tactical situation was evolving rapidly. The mercenaries had intensified their fire, clearly attempting to create space for the helicopter to land. Law enforcement responded in kind, but were hampered by their position and the approaching aircraft. They're going to make it out, Delgado realized with mounting frustration. That chopper pilot knows what he's doing, coming in fast and low, where our guys can't get a clean shot. Blackwood watched the unfolding extraction with cold analysis. These were professionals implementing a textbook contingency plan. Ellis had planned thoroughly, as always. The helicopter would touch down just long enough for the team to board, then disappear across the vast wilderness where pursuit would be nearly impossible unless someone disrupted the plan. "How good a shot are you, Officer Delgado?" Blackwood asked suddenly. Delgado patted his service weapon. "Qualified expert 6 years running. But this handgun doesn't have the range to hit that helicopter." "Not the helicopter," Blackwood clarified. "The ground team. From this elevation, with clear lines of sight, you could pin down the right flank of their position, force them away. From the landing zone." Understanding dawned on Delgado's face. "Create enough disruption to delay the extraction until our tactical team can reposition." "Exactly." Blackwood shifted painfully on Phantom's back, retrieving his own weapon. "I've got 4 rounds left. Make them count from this position." "What about you? You need medical attention ASAP." "I've lasted this long," Blackwood replied stoically. "Few more minutes won't make a difference." Decision made, Delgado took up position behind a large boulder, steadying his aim as he prepared to engage. Below, the helicopter had begun its final approach, kicking up a swirling cloud of dust as it descended toward a flat area just beyond. "The SUVs, on my mark," Blackwood instructed, the commander in him resurfacing despite his condition. 3, 2, 1, fire! Their shots rang out in perfect synchronization, striking the ground around the rightmost mercenary with impressive accuracy given the distance. The man dove for cover, his position suddenly untenable as Delgado continued to fire with methodical precision. The disruption created exactly the effect Blackwood had predicted. The mercenaries' carefully coordinated extraction plan faltered as their right flank collapsed inward, creating confusion and breaking their covering formation. Law enforcement seized the opportunity, tactical teams advancing rapidly to exploit the gap in their defense. The helicopter pilot recognized the deteriorating situation, aborting the landing attempt with a sudden surge of power that sent the aircraft climbing sharply away from the engagement zone. One of the mercenaries broke cover, making a desperate run toward the departing helicopter, only to be cut down by law enforcement fire. "They're pulling out," Delgado observed, ceasing fire to conserve his remaining ammunition. Choppers abandoning. The ground team. Below, the tactical situation had shifted decisively. With their extraction gone and their position compromised, the remaining mercenaries recognized the futility of continued resistance. One by one, they emerged from cover, hands raised in surrender. "Smart decision," Blackwood murmured, watching. As sheriff's deputies moved in to secure the prisoners, Ellis didn't pay them enough to die for this mission. The helicopter banked sharply, disappearing behind a distant ridge as it fled the scene. Delgado keyed his radio again. "Dispatch. Hostiles are surrendering. Helicopter has aborted extraction and is fleeing eastbound. We need medical up here. On the mesa for Colonel Blackwood." "Roger that. Medivac has been standing by, vectoring to your position now." The immediate danger past, Blackwood's adrenaline began to ebb, the full weight of his injuries and exhaustion crashing over him like a wave. He swayed precariously on Phantom's back, vision graying at the edges. "Whoa, Colonel!" Delgado moved quickly to steady him. "Stay with us. Help's coming." Phantom stood rock steady, seemingly understanding the need to remain absolutely still as Blackwood fought to maintain consciousness. The Mustang's ears flicked backward, monitoring his rider's condition with the same vigilance he'd shown throughout. Their ordeal. "My horse," Blackwood managed, his voice barely audible. "Take care of my horse." "That's a promise, sir," Delgado assured him. "Pretty sure he's earned a medal after today." A new sound joined the cacophony of tactical radios and shouted commands from below, the distinctive whine of a medical helicopter approaching from the west. Delgado moved to a clearing, waving his arms to guide the incoming aircraft toward their position. As darkness began to encroach on Blackwood's consciousness, his hand remained tangled in Phantom's mane, the connection between man and horse unbroken even as his strength failed. The Mustang nickered softly, turning his head to gently nuzzle Blackwood's leg, as if promising to remain steadfast. "Good boy," Blackwood whispered, the words carrying all the gratitude and respect he could no longer articulate as the medevac helicopter descended in a swirl of dust and rotor wash. Mission accomplished. The medical team worked with practiced efficiency, easing Blackwood from Phantom's back onto a stretcher while starting IV fluids and assessing his injuries. The Mustang watched intently, refusing to move more than a few feet away, despite the frightening noise and commotion of the helicopter. "Never seen a horse stand ground like that near a chopper," one paramedic remarked incredulously as they prepared to load Blackwood for transport. "This isn't just any horse," Delgado explained, keeping a steadying hand on Phantom's halter, fashioned hastily from a spare tactical belt. He tracked through sniper fire, carried the colonel for miles, found escape routes better than any GPS. Never seen anything like it. The lead paramedic glanced between the wounded colonel and the vigilant Mustang, making a quick decision. "The colonel's crashing, BP's dropping. He needs surgery now." He hesitated, then added, "Load the horse too." "In the medevac?" Delgado couldn't hide his shock. Seen what happens when you separate wounded soldiers from their service animals. Whole aircraft has a reinforced floor for tactical extractions. He'll fit. Just keep him calm. Minutes later, in a feat of improvisation that would become legendary, throughout the department, Phantom was guided into the helicopter alongside Blackwood's stretcher. The Mustang stood with unnatural stillness as the aircraft lifted off, seemingly understanding the vital nature of their final journey together. As the helicopter banked toward the trauma center in Flagstaff, Delgado watched from the mesa top, marveling at the bond he'd witnessed. In 17 years of law enforcement, he'd seen courage in many forms, but nothing compared to the loyalty and intelligence of a Mustang who had defied every natural instinct to save his human companion. The radio at his hip crackled with an update from the ground team. "All hostiles in custody. No casualties among law enforcement. Colonel's medevac is inbound to Flagstaff Memorial with an ETA of 12 minutes. A pause, then with evident disbelief. "Dispatch, be advised they've apparently evacuated the horse as well. Over." Delgado smiled as he keyed his response. "Confirmed. That horse earned his flight. Making my way down to your position now. We've got some statements to take." As he began the careful descent from the mesa, Delgado reflected on the extraordinary series of events that had begun with a Mustang stopping a patrol car in the middle of Highway 77. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. His report would be the most unusual of his entire career. The fluorescent lights of Flagstaff Memorial's Trauma Center cast harsh shadows across Dr. Sarah Begay's face as she studied the chart in her hands. 20 years as a trauma surgeon in northern Arizona had exposed her to every manner of desert injury and accident, but Colonel James Blackwood's case was unprecedented in several ways. BP's stabilizing. Third unit of blood going in now, she reported to her team, glancing up at the monitors surrounding the colonel's bed in the ICU. Infections the biggest concern. Residual limb shows signs of developing sepsis from prolonged exposure after prosthetic damage. The nurse beside her nodded, adjusting the broad-spectrum antibiotics flowing into Blackwood's IV. Orthopedics is sending someone up to evaluate the stump. They're talking about possible surgical debridement. Let's hold off until we see if these antibiotics make a dent, Dr. Begay replied, her attention shifting to the colonel's other injuries: dehydration, exhaustion, a collection of lacerations and contusions consistent with his harrowing escape through the desert. He's tough. Vitals are better than they have any right to be after what he's been through. A commotion in the hallway drew her attention. Raised voices, the distinctive click of law enforcement radios, and most unusually, the sound of hooves on the polished hospital floor. Dr. Begay frowned, stepping toward the door of the ICU. "What now?" she muttered, pushing through the double doors into a scene that momentarily rendered her speechless. A magnificent black Mustang stood in the middle of the ICU waiting area, surrounded by a mixture of security personnel, police officers, and bewildered hospital staff. The horse was being restrained, barely, by Officer Ray Delgado, whose uniform was dust-covered and torn from his part in the desert pursuit. "This animal cannot be in my hospital," Dr. Begay stated firmly, medical authority overriding her surprise. "Officer, I don't care what extraordinary circumstances brought him here, but..." "Ma'am," Delgado interrupted respectfully but firmly, "this horse saved Colonel Blackwood's life multiple times today, carried him miles through the desert with a bleeding leg, led us through terrain no human could navigate, found water when we had none. The colonel crashed twice in the medevac, both times letting the horse close to him stabilized his vitals." Dr. Begay blinked, medical training warring with the implausibility of what she was hearing. "That's impossible. Stress responses don't work that way." A tall Native American man in a sheriff's department tactical uniform stepped forward. "Dr. Begay, I'm Lieutenant Thomas Whitefeather, Navajo County Sheriff's Department. I've debriefed Officer Delgado and the tactical team. Everything he's telling you is documented by multiple officers." He glanced at the Mustang with something approaching reverence. "There's something unusual about this animal's connection to the colonel." The horse, as if understanding it was the subject of discussion, nickered softly, pulling against Delgado's makeshift halter in the direction of the ICU, where Blackwood lay unconscious. Dr. Begay ran a hand through her short black hair, medical pragmatism battling with the evidence before her eyes. "This is completely against protocol. The infection risk alone..." "With respect, Doctor," Whitefeather interjected, "Colonel Blackwood has information vital to an ongoing federal investigation into private military contractors operating illegally on U.S. soil. His survival isn't just a medical matter, it's a matter of national security." The Mustang pulled forward again, dark eyes fixed on the ICU doors with unnerving intelligence. A young nurse standing nearby gasped as the horse stretched its neck toward her, gently taking her sleeve between its lips before tugging in the direction of Blackwood's room. The gesture was so deliberately communicative that even Dr. Begay found herself momentarily speechless. "I've treated Navajo veterans for 20 years, she said finally. "I've seen healing connections that Western medicine can't explain. But a horse in my ICU?" She shook her head, then made a decision she knew might cost her job. 5 minutes. "The animal has to be clean. Wipe him down completely with disinfectant. Delgado, you're responsible for him. Any sign of distress from my patient, you remove the horse immediately. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am." Delgado nodded gratefully. 20 minutes later, after a thorough cleaning that the Mustang endured with surprising patience, Phantom was led carefully into Blackwood's ICU room. The staff had created a path, moving equipment, and stands to accommodate the horse's bulk in the cramped space. Hospital administrators would have apoplexy if they knew, but the night supervisor had been convinced by Lieutenant Whitefeather's quiet authority and the extraordinary circumstances. The Mustang approached Blackwood's bed with delicate steps, lowering his head to sniff gently at the colonel's hand, where it lay motionless atop the white hospital sheet. A soft nickering sound emanated from the horse, barely audible over the beeping monitors. Dr. Begay watched skeptically, prepared to order the animal removed at the first sign of problems. Instead, she found herself staring in disbelief at the cardiac monitor. Blackwood's heart rate, which had been erratic since admission, gradually steadied into a stronger, more regular rhythm. His oxygen saturation, which had hovered at concerning levels despite supplemental oxygen, began to climb. "That's not placebo effect," she murmured, scientific mind racing to find a logical explanation. "He's unconscious." Lieutenant Whitefeather nodded knowingly. "The Diné have understood the healing power of animal bonds for generations, Doctor. Western medicine is just beginning to catch up." Phantom remained absolutely still beside the bed, his muzzle resting lightly against Blackwood's, dark eyes never leaving the colonel's face. The horse's presence seemed to fill the sterile room with something intangible yet powerful, a connection that transcended conventional understanding. To everyone's astonishment, Blackwood's fingers twitched, then slowly moved to rest against Phantom's muzzle. His eyes remained closed, but the movement was deliberate, not reflexive. "He's responding," the nurse whispered, checking the neurological monitors. "Brain activity increasing." Dr. Begay moved to the bedside, professional curiosity overriding her skepticism. "Colonel Blackwood, can you hear me? You're at Flagstaff Memorial Hospital. You're safe." Blackwood's eyelids fluttered, then opened partway, his gaze immediately, seeking and finding Phantom. The ghost of a smile touched his pale lips. "Good boy," he whispered, voice barely audible. "Knew you'd stay." The Mustang nickered softly in response, the sound somehow conveying profound relief. Dr. Begay found herself blinking back, unexpected moisture in her eyes, moved despite her medical detachment by the obvious bond between man and animal. "Your horse is quite the celebrity, Colonel," she said, checking his pupils with a penlight. "Half the sheriff's department is in my waiting room telling stories about him." "Not my horse," Blackwood managed, each word an effort. "Partner saved me more times than I deserved." Lieutenant Whitefeather stepped forward, placing a respectful hand on Phantom's flank. "Colonel, I hate to intrude, but we need to know. Did you recognize any of the men who attacked you? We have 4 in custody, but we believe the helicopter. A pilot escaped with at least 1 other operative." Blackwood's eyes sharpened slightly, military discipline asserting itself despite his condition. "Mercenaries. From Aegis Group, Ellis's private contractors. The leader, South African accent, called himself Kruger. Whitefeather nodded grimly. Matches what we got from the men in custody. We've contacted federal authorities. This has escalated beyond local jurisdiction. They'll try again, Blackwood warned, voice strengthening as adrenaline temporarily overrode his exhaustion. Ellis has resources, connections in high places. This doesn't end until he's satisfied. You let us worry about that, Colonel, Whitefeather assured him. We've got officers stationed throughout this floor. FBI team is en route from Phoenix. You focus on healing. Dr. Begay checked Blackwood's latest blood work results on the bedside. Un tablet, professional concern returning. The antibiotics are helping, but you're not out of the woods, Colonel. The infection in your residual limb is serious. We may need to perform surgical debridement to remove compromised tissue. Do what you have to, Doctor, Blackwood replied stoically. His hand remained resting on Phantom's muzzle, drawing strength from the connection. Just tell me this animal gets proper care while I'm laid up. Already arranged, sir, Officer Delgado spoke up from near the door. Tribal police have a stable facility behind their headquarters. Lieutenant Whitefeather has personally guaranteed his safety and comfort. Blackwood's eyes met Whitefeather's in silent assessment, one warrior evaluating another. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. Thank you, Lieutenant. He's not ordinary. Never has been. I can see that, Whitefeather replied with quiet respect. The elders would say he carries strong medicine, a spirit guide in animal form. Despite his weakened state, Blackwood managed a small nod. Wouldn't argue with that assessment. His eyes began to droop, the brief surge of energy fading as medications and exhaustion reclaimed him. Stay safe, boy, he murmured to Phantom. I'll be back on my feet soon. His voice trailed off as he slipped back into unconsciousness, hand still resting against the Mustang's velvety muzzle. The horse remained motionless, as if understanding the need for absolute stillness beside the medical equipment. Dr. Begay checked Blackwood's vitals again, noting with surprise that they remained stronger than before Phantom's arrival. Whatever connection exists here, it's having measurable physiological effects, she admitted. Scientific curiosity piqued despite her initial skepticism. But we need to prepare for surgery. The horse can't stay in the operating room. How long until you take him in? Whitefeather asked. Surgical team is being assembled now, maybe an hour. Whitefeather nodded thoughtfully. Then let them have this hour. When a warrior falls in battle, the presence of a trusted companion can do more than medicine alone. Dr. Begay found herself unable to argue with the simple wisdom in his words. 1 hour, she agreed, directing her staff to make preparations while giving man and horse their moment of connection. Outside the hospital, federal authorities were already arriving. Dark SUVs with government plates disgorging serious-faced agents who conferred in low voices with local law enforcement. The attempted assassination of a decorated colonel by private military contractors on American soil had escalated into a multi-agency investigation that promised to uncover layers of corruption and illegal operations. Inside the ICU, none of that mattered. Phantom stood vigil beside Blackwood's bed, a silent guardian whose presence seemed to infuse the clinical environment with something ancient and powerful. The hospital staff moved around them respectfully, medical protocols temporarily yielding to a bond that defied conventional explanation. Officer Delgado remained by the door, witnessing the scene with quiet amazement. In his 17 years of law enforcement, he had seen courage in many forms, but never anything like the Mustang who had appeared on Highway 77, begging for help with such deliberate intelligence. That horse understands everything happening. "In this room," he murmured to Lieutenant Whitefeather, "I'd swear to it in court." Whitefeather nodded, unsurprised. "My grandfather would say some animals carry human souls. Warriors return to continue protecting those they care for." He studied Phantom with thoughtful eyes. The old stories tell of such bonds. Most dismiss them as legends. "After what I saw today," Delgado replied, "I'm rethinking a lot of what I used to dismiss." The hour passed too quickly. When the surgical team arrived to prepare Blackwood for the procedure, Phantom seemed to understand it was time to leave. The Mustang gently withdrew his muzzle from beneath Blackwood's hand, stepping back with careful precision to avoid disturbing any equipment. "I've never seen a horse move like that in a confined space," Dr. Begay remarked, professional curiosity momentarily overriding her focus on the upcoming surgery. "The spatial awareness is remarkable. Everything about him is remarkable." Delgado agreed, taking hold of the makeshift halter to guide Phantom from the room. "You have no idea what he did out there today." As they led the Mustang from the ICU, hospital staff lined the corridor, word having spread about the extraordinary animal who had navigated sniper fire, desert ambushes, and helicopter evacuations to save his human companion. Phantom walked with his head high, dark eyes surveying the gathered crowd with intelligence that seemed to acknowledge their respect. Outside, dusk had fallen over Flagstaff, the first stars appearing in the deepening blue of the desert sky. Lieutenant Whitefeather had arranged transportation for Phantom to the tribal police facilities, where the Mustang would be given the finest care while Blackwood underwent surgery and recovery. "I'll stay with him tonight," Delgado volunteered, as they loaded Phantom into a specially equipped trailer. "After what we've been through together, seems wrong to leave him with strangers." Whitefeather nodded approval. The colonel chose his friends well, both human and equine. He glanced toward the hospital, expression grave. "My men will maintain watch here. Ellis has resources, but so do we. This is Navajo land. We protect our own, and the colonel has earned that status today." As the trailer pulled away from the hospital, Phantom turned his head, gazing back toward the building where Blackwood fought for his life. The Mustang's eyes reflected the hospital lights, dark pools of awareness that seemed to hold knowledge beyond animal instinct. "He'll be all right," Delgado told the horse, reaching through the trailer window to stroke his neck. "The colonel's a fighter, just like you." Phantom nickered softly in response, the sound carrying through the desert evening like a promise, or perhaps a prayer, as they began the journey to temporary sanctuary while the battle for Blackwoods. Life continued in the operating room behind them. Dawn broke over the Navajo tribal police headquarters, painting the desert landscape in hues of amber and gold. Phantom stood at the fence of the temporary paddock, head raised toward the east, nostrils flaring as he scented the morning air. Despite the comfortable accommodations and attentive care he'd received through the night, the Mustang remained. Restless, dark eyes frequently turning in the direction of Flagstaff Memorial Hospital, miles distant but clearly fixed in his awareness. Officer Delgado approached with a bucket of fresh water, his uniform replaced by borrowed civilian clothes. After his marathon shift, dark circles beneath his eyes testified to his vigil through the night, splitting time between the hospital and the tribal facility to keep tabs on both Blackwood and Phantom. "Morning, hero!" he greeted the horse, setting down the water bucket. Colonel made it through surgery. Doctors say he's stable but critical. Thought you'd want to know. Phantom turned his attention to Delgado. Ears pricked forward as if processing every word. The horse's intelligence continued to unnerve the officer, defying everything he thought he understood about animal cognition. Lieutenant Whitefeather says I can bring you back to visit once the colonel's awake and moved out of recovery. Delgado continued, reaching out to stroke the Mustang's glossy neck. Hospital administrator had a fit about your first visit, but the FBI team overruled him. Turns out national security trumps hospital regulations. Phantom nickered softly, pushing his muzzle against Delgado's shoulder in what seemed like gratitude. The gesture felt so deliberate, so human in its intent, that Delgado found himself responding as he would to a person. "You're welcome," he said, then laughed at himself. "Listen to me, having a conversation with a horse. If my sergeant could see me now..." "It's not as crazy as you think." The voice came from behind him. Delgado turned to find Lieutenant Whitefeather approaching, accompanied by an elderly Navajo man whose deeply lined face and traditional attire marked him as one of the tribal elders. The old man walked with the aid of a gnarled juniper staff, his movements deliberate but steady despite his advanced years. "Officer Delgado, this is my grandfather, Benjamin Whitefeather," the lieutenant introduced them. "He's a respected healer among our people and has some experience with unusual animal encounters." The elder nodded respectfully to Delgado, then turned his attention to Phantom, who had gone absolutely still at the old man's approach, ears forward and eyes locked on the newcomer with intense focus. "My grandson told me about this one," Benjamin said, his English clear but shaped by the cadences of his native tongue. "Said he showed understanding beyond what horses should possess." "That's putting it mildly, sir," Delgado replied. "I've never seen anything like what this animal did yesterday. He tracked through desert terrain like he was reading a map, carried an injured man for miles, found hidden paths that saved our lives. And the way he flagged down my patrol car, it wasn't random behavior. He knew exactly what he was doing." Benjamin nodded, unsurprised by the account. He approached the fence slowly, stopping several feet from Phantom. Rather than reaching out to touch the horse, he simply stood, meeting the Mustang's gaze with steady calm. For several minutes, neither moved, locked in what appeared to be a silent communion. Finally, the elder spoke, his voice pitched low. "This one carries old medicine, very old, the kind our stories speak of but few have seen in living memory." "What do you mean, grandfather?" Lieutenant Whitefeather asked, his official demeanor softened in the presence of his elder. "Some souls choose to return in different forms," Benjamin explained, never breaking eye contact with Phantom. "Warriors especially. The bond with their human companion doesn't end with death, only changes shape." He gestured toward the Mustang with a weathered hand. "This one protects the soldier because they have traveled together before, in another life." Delgado shifted uncomfortably, the explanation venturing into spiritual territory beyond his experience. "Sir, with respect, this horse was captured during a BLM roundup. He has documentation, a history." "The form is new," Benjamin agreed, untroubled by the officer's skepticism. "The connection is ancient. Ask Colonel Blackwood how they met, how they recognized each other." Lieutenant Whitefeather watched his grandfather with respectful attention. "What should we do, grandfather? The colonel is fighting infection. The doctors are concerned." Benjamin considered this, finally breaking his gaze from Phantom to address his grandson. "The medicine this one carries cannot work at a distance. They must be together." Hospital administration is pushing back hard on allowing the horse to return, Delgado explained. Dr. Begay made an exception during the emergency, but then the man must come here, Benjamin said simply, as if proposing the most logical solution. Lieutenant Whitefeather shook his head. Grandfather, he's in intensive care. They can't move him to a stable. Not the stable, Benjamin clarified. Our healing center at the reservation clinic. Dr. Begay trained there before medical school. She understands our ways alongside Western medicine. He tapped his staff against the ground for emphasis. Sometimes healing requires more than machines and medicines. It requires reconnection. Lieutenant Whitefeather considered his grandfather's words, then nodded slowly. I'll speak with Dr. Begay. She might understand, especially given what she witnessed in the ICU. As the men discussed logistics, Phantom remained focused on Benjamin, the Mustang's usual restlessness temporarily calmed by the elder's presence. There was something remarkable in the silent exchange between ancient healer and enigmatic horse, a recognition that transcended conventional understanding. Miles away at Flagstaff Memorial, Colonel Blackwood fought his own battle against infection and trauma. The surgical debridement of his residual limb had been successful, removing compromised tissue while preserving maximum function. But post-operative infection had taken hold despite aggressive antibiotic treatment, his temperature spiking dangerously through the night as his body struggled against invading pathogens. Dr. Begay studied his latest lab results with growing concern, the numbers telling a story of a system under siege. Despite his remarkable physical conditioning and obvious will to survive, the colonel's reserves had been depleted by his ordeal in the desert. The infection was gaining ground. We need to adjust his antibiotic protocol, she instructed the ICU. Nurse, switch to the broad-spectrum reserve option and increase the dosage. Yes, doctor, the nurse acknowledged, making notes in the electronic chart. FBI agents are asking for an update on his condition. They're hoping to get a formal statement once he's conscious. Dr. Begay shook her head firmly. Not happening today. His system is already overtaxed. Tell them medical needs take precedence over their investigation. As she completed her examination, her phone vibrated with an incoming call. The screen showed Lieutenant Whitefeather's name. Stepping into the hallway, she answered with professional briskness. Lieutenant, if you're calling about Colonel Blackwood, I'm afraid his condition has deteriorated overnight. The infection is proving resistant to our initial antibiotics. Whitefeather's voice came through clearly, his tone measured but urgent. That's why I'm calling, Doctor. My grandfather has made a suggestion you might find unconventional. Dr. Begay listened as the lieutenant outlined Benjamin Whitefeather's proposal to transfer Blackwood to the reservation's healing center, where Phantom could be part of his recovery. Her medical training immediately raised a dozen objections to moving a critically ill patient, but the memory of Blackwood's improved vitals in the horse's presence gave her pause. The tribal clinic doesn't have the resources of Flagstaff Memorial, she said finally. We're talking about a patient with a severe post-surgical infection who needs constant monitoring. I understand your concerns, Whitefeather replied, but my grandfather believes the colonel's connection to this horse is essential to his healing. And after what I witnessed in the ICU, I'm inclined to believe him. Dr. Begay sighed, caught between Western medical protocols and the traditional healing practices she had studied in her youth on the reservation. Let me examine the patient. Again, If his condition doesn't improve with the new antibiotic protocol over the next 6 hours, we can discuss transfer options. But I'd need assurances the clinic is properly equipped for his level of care. I'll arrange everything, Whitefeather. Promised. We have federal resources available given the circumstances of his case. Whatever equipment you need can be transferred. After ending the call, Dr. Begay returned to Blackwood's bedside, studying his unconscious form with newfound contemplation. Throughout her medical career, she had witnessed recovery patterns that defied conventional explanation. Patients who thrived or failed based on factors beyond measurable medical interventions. The Colonel's unusual bond with Phantom fell into that nebulous territory where science offered incomplete answers. 6 hours later, Blackwood's condition had stabilized but not improved. The new antibiotics had prevented further deterioration, but his fever remained elevated, his body locked in a holding pattern rather than actively healing. Dr. Begay made her decision, initiating a series of calls that would ultimately lead to one of the most unusual patient transfers in Flagstaff Memorial's history. By sunset, a medical convoy departed the hospital, an ambulance equipped with advanced monitoring equipment, flanked by tribal police vehicles and federal agents in unmarked cars. Inside the ambulance, Dr. Begay herself monitored Blackwood's vitals. Having insisted on personally supervising the transfer she had reluctantly authorized. "I still think this is crazy," she told the paramedic assisting her. 20 years of medical training, and I'm taking a critical patient to see a horse because an old medicine man suggested it." The paramedic, a young Navajo woman, smiled slightly. "My grandmother would say you're finally using all your training, not just the parts they taught in medical school." The Tribal Healing Center was a modern facility that blended contemporary medical practice with traditional Navajo healing approaches. Upon their arrival, Blackwood was transferred to a specially prepared room equipped with the monitoring technology Dr. Begay had insisted upon, but with modifications that reflected its unique purpose. Wide doors, reinforced flooring, and a layout that could accommodate an equine visitor. Benjamin Whitefeather had prepared the space according to traditional practices, burning sacred herbs and placing symbolic items at cardinal points around the room. Dr. Begay, despite her scientific skepticism, found herself respecting the old ways, remembering her grandmother's teachings about healing that addressed spirit alongside body. "Is the horse ready?" she asked Lieutenant Whitefeather as they finalized Blackwood's transfer into the specialized bed. "Officer Delgado is bringing him now," the lieutenant confirmed. "They've worked together through this whole situation. The horse trusts him." As if summoned by their conversation, the facility's rear doors opened to admit Phantom, led by Delgado with the gentlest of guidance. The Mustang moved with deliberate care through the hallway, his hooves muffled by temporary rubber matting laid down for the occasion. Hospital staff and tribal healers alike pressed against the walls, making space for the unusual visitor while watching with undisguised fascination. When Phantom reached Blackwood's room, he paused at the threshold, nostrils flaring as he processed the unfamiliar sense of medicine and machinery. His ears swiveled forward, focusing on the still form in the hospital bed. Delgado released the lead rope, stepping back with instinctive understanding that what happened next needed to unfold without human interference. The Mustang entered slowly, approaching Blackwood's bedside with the same deliberate care he had shown in the ICU. Dr. Begay found herself holding her breath as Phantom lowered his head, nostrils inches from Blackwood's face, breathing in his scent while seemingly assessing his condition. What happened next would become the subject of debate among medical professionals and tribal healers alike for years to come. Phantom pressed his muzzle gently against Blackwood's chest, directly over his heart, and remained absolutely still. The monitors recording the colonel's vital signs began to show subtle but unmistakable changes. Heart rate strengthening, oxygen saturation improving, even his temperature beginning. A slow decline from its fevered elevation. "That's not psychosomatic," Dr. Begay murmured, watching the numbers with professional astonishment. "He's unconscious. There's no mind-body explanation for this response." Benjamin Whitefeather nodded, unsurprised. The medicine doesn't need the mind to be aware. The spirits recognize each other. For 3 hours, Phantom maintained his position, occasionally shifting slightly, but never breaking contact with Blackwood. No one in the room spoke above a whisper, the atmosphere charged with something beyond ordinary understanding. Medical staff checked equipment with professional discretion, while tribal healers observed with knowing eyes, the two worlds of healing finding rare harmony in the shared experience. As night deepened outside, Blackwood's eyes finally opened. Clarity, returning to his gaze for the first time since surgery. He registered Phantom's presence without surprise, as if expecting nothing less than to find the Mustang beside him in this unfamiliar place. "Hey, soldier," he whispered, voice rough but stronger than it had been in the ICU. His hand lifted shakily to touch Phantom's muzzle. "Still on duty, I see." Dr. Begay moved forward, professionalism reasserting itself as she checked his pupils and vital signs. "Colonel Blackwood, you're at the Tribal Healing Center. We transferred you here when your infection wasn't responding well to treatment. How are you feeling?" "Better," he replied simply, gaze never leaving Phantom. "Much better." His hand moved to scratch behind the horse's ear with the familiarity of long practice. "He's been here the whole time." 3 hours, she confirmed, "and your vitals have been improving steadily since his arrival." She hesitated, scientific training warring, with the evidence before her eyes. "I can't explain the mechanism, but the effect is undeniable." Blackwood smiled faintly. "Some things aren't meant to be explained, Doctor." His attention returned to Phantom, whose dark eyes remained fixed on his face with unwavering focus. "We've always understood each other, haven't we, boy?" From the first moment, Benjamin Whitefeather stepped forward, his weathered face serene in the room's soft lighting. "The horse knew you before," he said simply. "In another life, perhaps. The soul recognizes its companions across many journeys." Rather than dismiss the elder's words, Blackwood nodded slowly. "When I found him at that rehabilitation program, he was supposed to be dangerous, untrainable. But he looked at me like he was waiting, like he recognized me." His voice dropped lower, meant for Phantom alone. "And I recognized him too. Here's a brief ending for your story. In the months that followed, Colonel Blackwood recovered fully under the dual care of Western medicine and tribal healing. The federal investigation revealed Ellis's extensive corruption, leading to additional charges that would keep him imprisoned for life. Blackwood and Phantom returned to their cabin, their bond now legendary throughout Arizona. The Mustang's extraordinary actions inspired a veterans program pairing rescued horses with wounded warriors, healing spirits on both sides of the connection. One evening, as sunset painted the desert in amber and gold, Blackwood watched Phantom galloping freely across. Their land, powerful and wild, yet choosing to return each day. Some bonds, he murmured, transcend understanding. The Mustang turned, silhouetted against the fading light, a guardian spirit in equine form who had crossed desert and danger to save his human companion. If you enjoyed this incredible journey of loyalty and courage, please subscribe for more. Heartwarming stories of extraordinary animal heroes. A new adventure awaits you every week.